George Haas, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm so excited for this episode.
Fingers crossed.
Surrender to the divine flow. I'm very grateful to Michael Holt for making the introduction.
I love Michael.
Yes. The savage and the sane. He spoke very highly of you when he was on the program, and we had a great conversation. And we've actually been chatting it up for an hour since you arrived, and we've been having a great back and forth. I'm excited to share with our audience. Let's dive in. I was asking you a bit about this on the couch while we were sitting. You had this long artistic music, photography, film, New York flow, and then this shift came to LA, started sitting with Shinzen Young, exploring with Dan Brown. I'm so interested, what was the point of shift for you towards interest in spirituality, interest in awakening? And that was around 2003?
I'm a child of the 60s, so it was the White Album by the Beatles. Actually, that did that. I was in high school in the 60s, and it was hippie times, and so we began then. I grew up upper middle class in Chicago, in the Chicago area, and highly upwardly mobile parents. Both of my grandmothers were first generation Irish, famine Irish, so poor. They came and were very indoctrinated into the idea that we should be upwardly mobile, and so I had that education. My father was sadistic. My mother was really not that functional. And so the childhood was kind of rough. And what from your own childhood experience perhaps is that you go along with the way the house runs until you get to adolescence. And then when your mind changes just from the natural growth of the cognitive capacity, you can analyze for the first time whether the deals that your parents made with you were good deals or not. And if you discover that they actually were not good deals and that they were really only serving the interests of your parents, you turn away from all adults. You turn away from your parents, but because the cognitive capacities of the adolescent brain are not that well organized, you make a kind of blanket decision that all adults are not trustworthy. And then who do you turn to but your peer group of people who've also made that decision? And then you try and organize your passage through this part of the childhood transition into youth. And so there was also a lot of drug and alcohol use. I was already an addict in elementary school. So when I say that the conditions in my household were rough, it was rough enough that in fifth grade I would come home and make a vodka gimlet to have de-stress from the day. But that also produces a lot of unhappiness, and so when the kind of psychedelia of the time suggested turning towards spiritual solutions, we were all gung-ho and went into it. I went. There's also the sort of financial aspect of pursuing alternative spiritual practices. TM was also very popular. That was the practice that the Maharishi was offering to the Beatles, and to get your mantra at that time was $400. $400 in 1968 was a lot of money, way more than I could get my hands on. And so I went to the cafeteria of Northwestern University, which was in the town I grew up in, and talked a college student into giving me his mantra, even though it was supposed to be kept secret. And practiced with that for a while and developed concentration from that, and that was useful. But the addiction swept right over that and really didn't produce much in terms of awakening. So I left home and lived on the street for about 15 months or so. That was harrowing. I tended to think of it at the time as my great sort of vagabond adventure, but it was actually just living on the street homeless, which was not great after all. I came home, and one of the things about living on the street is that it's really boring. And so I decided that I needed to do something that would make living on the street less boring. And so I decided that if I could learn how to take photographs, I could document my experience living on the street, and that would be really interesting. So I came home, and my parents were willing to pay for college, but nothing else really. And so I enrolled in a community college and took a class on photography, but that became so interesting to me that living on the street no longer had an appeal. And so I then began pursuing my art education. So in Chicago, I went to the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts because I could just apply and get in. My high school transcript was rather poor, except my SAT scores were pretty good for the time. And so I met Byron Grush at Chicago Academy, who, if you lived in Chicago, you might know he's an underground filmmaker, really interesting guy, and really expanded my understanding of what that could be. Then I went to the Art Institute. I'm really more attracted to teachers and what they have to show me than I am to curriculums or degrees. Mm-hmm. And so I have never gotten a degree, but I have gotten a lot of credits. I went to Mexico for a while, came back. My attempts to get my family situation to work better failed, and so I moved to New York. I'm answering your question, so don't worry.
I'm enjoying the
journey. I'm a gay man, so and it's very different now than it was then. When you came out, when in your early 20s, which is when some people did it, I did it a little earlier than that. You just reconciled to the fact that your family and your friends would abandon you, and you would have to start over. It was one of the big hitches in people coming out. You had to make a decision about being a second-class citizen and accepting that, and you had to make a decision of losing everyone you've ever loved in order to pursue this other thing. So that other thing has to be really important to do. I went to New York, and it turned out to be a really spectacularly good time to go there. They're talking about that period of New York, the sort of the second half of the 70s into the early 80s, as a period of artistic expression equivalent to Paris in the 20s. So if you can imagine, I had a 1,400 square foot loft on 11th and Broadway, which I paid $174 a month for. So 4 years ago when I was in New York, it was for rent, and I looked it up. It was $8,500 a month. So you can see the difference in that. So we only had to work 2 days a week, and then we could spend the other 5 days a week running around creating art. And so there was this real explosion of expression at that time.
Wow.
I like to say that period ended because of AIDS, crack, and finance, finance being the most pernicious of them all, obviously. And so in the gay community at that time, when you'd had this first burst of freedom and you could actually be open about who you were and actually make relationships around an authentic expression of who you were as best you could. If you grow up gay and you identify it early in your life, you also grow up to learn how to pretend to be someone else, because the consequences of coming out at that time were so severe. So it creates a fracture in self-identity. And so we have this burst of enormous creative energy, this burst of social connection, really a very intense and beautiful time, which then is consumed by a pandemic, or not a pandemic in the sense, or an epidemic of incurable disease that's 100% fatal. Different than this pandemic, right? This pandemic is 3% fatal, but if you can contrast that to the idea of if you get infected, you die, very different. And it really went through the community in a devastating way, quite different in terms of the response of the government. Reagan was president and he said nothing. 100,000 people died before they made a statement, and it wasn't the president making the statement. It was his press secretary who said that AIDS is God's punishment for homosexuality. That was the government response. And so the community came together to attend to the people who were sick and dying, and it was a very scary death cycle. The complete failure of your immune system, and it was also happening to young people in a way that was quite alarming. The people that I was caring for when they died were in their 20s. Beautiful, this, we talked about it a little bit. The 20s is such a vibrant, interesting time as people come out of the childhood, come out of the adolescence into who they're going to be. Really an extraordinary time. And so that moment was the moment that the shift happened, and I recognized that I needed to go in a direction that would provide a deep spiritual connection to make sense out of what was happening. I had gotten sober already. I got sober when I was 24. I had cirrhosis of the liver when I was 23. My younger brother was killed in a motorcycle accident, and the loss was unbearable, and my drinking accelerated to the point that I had stage 3 cirrhosis when I was 23. So overachiever. So got sober at 24, and then in my late 20s, of course, it was just attending to the deaths, one death after another. If you can picture it, imagine every 3 months going to the funeral of one of your close friends for years, with no support, in fact, ridicule and derision from society at large. So that was that period, and the place where I turned toward finding some kind of spiritual understanding of what was happening.
Wow. 5th grade drinking.
Yeah. I was difficult to manage, and so my dad medicated me with pharmaceuticals, and they turned a blind eye to the drinking.
And then there was a year and a half of homeless.
Not quite, 15 months.
And the picking up of the camera along the way, getting into photography, getting into art, and then moving to New York. And then a funeral every 3 months is devastating. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's an equivalency now, which is really the opioid epidemic, um, particularly in the addiction community, where because the politics of addiction in this country are difficult. But what happened was that because the pharmaceutical companies managed to get the government to pay retail prices for painkillers for chronic pain, they became available everywhere at reasonable prices. But when you were buying them on the street, you were actually buying manufactured, pharmaceutical company manufactured products, so you could rely on what the packaging was. When the epidemic exploded and people began to respond to it by demanding that the drug companies stop selling so much of this stuff, they began to tighten the screws on it. You may remember a few years ago the government stopped paying for the pharmaceuticals, which was the driver of the pharmaceutical side of the epidemic. Then the bootlegs came in, and the bootlegs were made with fentanyl, which is really unpredictable, and you need small quantities of it to overdose from it. And so there's a surge of overdoses that have come from the closing off of the easy access to genuine pharmaceuticals into bootleg pharmaceuticals. And so in that community, the deaths are equivalent in a way to what the AIDS deaths were. And they have the same difficulty integrating that constant loss. And they are also in the position of being derided by society as a whole as drug addicts, right? And so they don't really get much support in that way.
Yeah, there's a lot of perverse incentives that are being healed right now with better goal congruence around inclusive stakeholding and maximizing our potential rather than being extractive. And this has a lot to do with spiritual awakening, which we'll talk about. You had a lot of suffering that created the shift, which is a very common archetype, is the roots reaching down to hell so that the branches can blossom towards the heavens. But yeah, this started in 5th grade, really, and then it liver cirrhosis, 23, all these deaths, and just having that pivotal shift. So where did you go? Was that when you went to LA? Did you stay longer in New York?
No, I was still in New York. I actually discovered Trungpa Rinpoche. So Naropa. I'd already known about Naropa because Naropa was one of the choices that sort of the deep hippie divers went to for school. I had some problems with my capacity to trust anyone, let's put it that way. I found him untrustworthy as a person to make a teacher, but I enjoyed the writings and I practiced on my own. So I would call it a period of being a Dharma orphan. I was very interested in the teachings, very interested in the reading, but I was very uncomfortable becoming intimate with anybody or trusting anybody or believing that they wouldn't in some way turn around and exploit me. So I always stayed at a distance. But I had friends. We also did some journeying into the Red Road. I don't know if you've done any of the spiritual practices of native people, but so we did a lot of sweat lodges and those kinds of ceremonies. That was quite interesting in terms of the willingness to become open, and also in the beginning, of course, the extreme experience shatters the ego, shatters the self, and it just disappears, and then you're in this place of freedom from the experience of self. And if you've always been confined by the experience of self, it's an amazing freedom. Of course, the self comes back as soon as the difficult circumstances are abated, but you do have that breath there, that moment of freedom, and it's in the dark. And if you're sitting, say, we sat with, for some ceremonies with a medicine man from North Dakota, and he was just incredibly magical in terms of the experience that we had. Of course, as my meditation practice deepened, my capacity for equanimity in severe physical trials got so great that the self was very happily bobbing along the whole time. That was less magical. And then there's a kind of bonding that comes when you're sitting with people and they're dying and they know they're dying, and they're in pain, and you can open to that if you want to. And so there was a lot of that kind of caring. I didn't get infected, but I don't know why, because I certainly behaved in the same way that everyone else did. And there was that sort of puzzling piece.
You weren't here for that lesson. You were here to continue onward and share what you're sharing now with people around the world.
So what happened is New York became a haunted place for me. Everywhere I went, it would activated the grieving, and there was really no place to go. I had started an internet business in the late 80s, and when the 1989 recession hit, the company went under. And so I had my last 10 grand, and New York was haunted, and I decided that I'll come to Los Angeles and write screenplays. That seems like a good idea. So that's what I did. I was a filmmaker, in New York, and we made these underground movies, and we showed them in different places, different clubs, and I quite enjoyed that process. Non-narrative filmmaking, which was sort of the early Chicago's instructions I had, and then my reflux, which is what the cough is. And then I decided to go into narrative stuff. Anyway, I came to Los Angeles and decided to write screenplays in 1992. And
Yes, we have some of this is George's The Lower Manhattan Dormitory Effect, and this is some of his A Memoir of 1979 New York in Photographs and Lyric Prose Poetry. And there's other essayists that are in this as well, but it's very beautiful. He gifted this to me when he came, and there's a lot of what he's referencing right now.
so the book is divided into 3 sections. The first section is called The Lower Manhattan Dormitory Effect, and my first reputation in New York was as a poet, and so and I wrote lyric prose poetry, and so the first section of the book is this long poem that I wrote in New York that I finished in 1983, which describes that period of New York from the late 70s to the mid-'80s. And then the middle part of the book are a series of portraits that I made of the social group that I was in. Most of the people in the photographs died at that time from AIDS. So you'll see at the front of the book there's a dedication to the circle of friends that I lost. And then the third part of the book is called Chicago is not New York, Los Angeles is neither one, which is the answer to the question you've really just asked me.
Say the last line again.
Chicago is not New York, Los Angeles is neither one. So it's a description of moving from Chicago to New York and then moving from New York to Los Angeles and the spiritual journey that happened. That was John Kemp, who died in 1981. He was the first one. So if you remember your AIDS history, AIDS wasn't actually identified until 1984, but people started dying the summer of 79, which is why I chose 79 to be the subject of the book. And at that time, it was just an unexplained cancer that was killing people. And then it was gay-related immune deficiency syndrome.
Mm.
And then they discovered HIV. So.
And for those that are also interested in this, this is on. Is this available on Mettagroup.org as well?
It is, and you can also get it on Amazon. Cool. And there's also an ebook version of it if you don't want the paper. Although it is a beautiful book, so you might consider it. Mm-hmm. Those are before and after pictures in case. One of the great amusements of the book cover is that there's a picture of me now, and then there's a picture of me when I was 25, let's say, and everyone says, "I recognize you. Who's that?"
Yeah, exactly. At first,
the joy of aging, I like to call that.
Yeah, he told me when he walked in, he was like, "You're gonna age like this too, if you're lucky."
Right.
Yeah. If you don't today. So there was a period of documenting and doing film in this late 70s, early 80s, while the craziness was happening in New York of identifying what even was happening with HIV and AIDS. And then there was a entering into this internet era, and when you hit the recession, packing up, and you had been exploring spirituality, you had turned towards spirituality and had been exploring that, and then there was this, I'm going to go and continue doing film in LA, and then getting here. Then there was a process of also sort of recalibrating when you came here, because that was that like 15 years in New York?
16.
Okay.
And then here, I've lived here longer than anywhere else. In fact, I've lived in my current apartment longer than I've lived anywhere else. And I came out here to write screenplays, and I went at it pretty hard. And I had, I guess, 2 or 3 years where I was supporting myself doing that. And then I got a feature film, which is called Friends and Lovers. It's starring Robert Downey Jr., Steve Baldwin, and Claudia Schiffer. Suzanne Crier's in it. Danny Nucci's in it. Anyway, we made the movie. It was released, and it didn't do well critically or financially, and I got thrown into director's jail, which I never was able to figure out a way out of. And so that also put an end to my screenwriting efforts. But I also, at that time, wanted to begin to address the difficulties that were dogging me from my childhood. So I don't know what stock you put in Western psychological definitions of mental health issues, but I was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder in the early 90s. And it was a good explanation for me because it made sense why everything was so difficult. And so then I went into this process of trying to work through that. And at the time, it was really a mostly direct trauma reprocessing, really no understanding at all of attachment or attachment theory. And so it was a very difficult period of 4 or 5 years of working through that when I really didn't have bandwidth to do much else. So coming through that process, and out of that process, the main advantage of that was that I couldn't really get anything to happen in my film life while I was so dissociative, and working through the dissociation then allowed me to get my first feature to be made, and then the feature didn't do well, and so I didn't get to work beyond that. You know, as we like to say, the film business is one strike baseball, and so you either hit or you don't. So I needed to then imagine a different life. I think that what we really want to pursue in our lives is finding a sense of meaning or finding a sense of value in it. And most of the typical rewards of our society, which I experienced in my childhood, you know, an upper middle class upbringing is very materially rich. It was also, so as I like to say, a well-appointed torture chamber half the time, and so that wasn't appealing to me. I never was interested in pursuing any of that. And I had suffered so greatly. I was really focused on trying to find a way of being alive that actually had some sense of value to me, some sense of peacefulness. And so I had started meditating when I came to LA, and down in Venice at a place called Ordinary Dharma with Katriana Reed. I was, you know, my typical untrusting self, and they weren't kind enough for me. And so I moved back into a period of Dharma orphanhood. And then the next teacher I tried was Shinzen, and he actually miraculously was kind enough for me to be willing to sit with him as a teacher.
What does that mean, kind enough, during that time?
I wanted somebody who would just allow me to be the way that I was without demanding that I be different than I was.
The radical acceptance of exactly where you were at.
Right. Mm-hmm. That's what I wanted. And I didn't want to have to believe anything. And I didn't want to have to reveal more than I wanted or was comfortable revealing. And he was okay with that, all of that. You know, I'm think of myself as a clever person, and I would set up these elaborate obstacle courses for teachers to get through. That may be a better way of putting it, where you could fail at any moment and be slaughtered. And he was the only one who, up to that time, had managed to get through that. I think also it coincided with a lot of the work on the dissociation that I was doing. He also is, I like to say, an over-explainer. And we had some of this in our conversation earlier. I'm much more interested in the how to do it than what you're supposed to do. I want to know how you do it exactly, step by step, tiny little steps to describe the process. And he does that, which is really, so it's another reason why I study with Dan Brown. He's in the pointing out the great way tradition, which is just really descriptive of exactly how to do it, not what you're supposed to do, which I find too general and not helpful most of the time. And then that's also how I teach. It's not uncommon for somebody to say, stop over-explaining. But for somebody like me, I'm dyslexic, I'm dyspraxic, I'm dysgraphic, I'm dyscalculic. Learning is an arduous, slow process for me, and I need all of that support in order to understand. I do get to go deep because of that, but the things that aren't descriptive enough aren't helpful.
I love this. I love this focus right now. So, okay, so since... Oops, no worries. Awesome. Just move it a little bit closer again, like that. Excellent. I love this focus on the difference between what you're supposed to do versus how you're supposed to do it. I love this. Yeah, Shinzen does have a heavy focus on how, and so does Dan Brown, and that makes sense that then you ended up picking up that as well, and that it worked for you given where you had come from in your life. Let's have a little bit of a breakdown. Let's use the example of quieting the noisy mind, which is a very common example. So the what pointing is to say quiet the mind, and then the how pointing is to say use your breath and become aware of the space in which the clouds of thoughts arise and disappear. Is that about a good example?
I would say you don't have to quiet your mind.
Okay. All right.
I don't like that. What do you have to do, right?
Oh, okay. So you just go straight to the how.
Yeah.
And so there's no what of quiet the mind or still the mind or become aware of space or emptiness. It's just the how.
Particularly in the beginning when you can't do it anyway.
Okay, so then even that whole... But isn't the utility of putting the star into place of where we're heading with the how?
So what I would say is you don't have to still the mind. You just have to be able to maintain concentration. So what we're going to work on is you letting the whole mind be as busy as it's ever been and just being able to pinpoint your concentration and hold awareness of that. And we'll use the breath. So pick a place on the breath where you want to watch it. Tip of the nose, opening of the mouth, back of the throat, rising of the chest, rising of the belly. Take a look now. See where you can really detect that sensation easily, and then we'll put your attention there.
And may I ask for our audience and for just the cadence of taking this a little bit slower, because you're going through it like you've been teaching for 18 years. Yes. And so, yeah, let's take it with
I would go that fast, actually, with a new student.
Okay, give us all of the different...
They don't have time to
locations. Where in the how are all of the different locations? Because there's a very common recognizing in the traditions of example in Vipassana where you can become aware on the very nostril itself and on the very top of the mouth itself, and become aware of which nostril the inhalation is coming into. So let's go through those examples one more time.
Well, okay, then bring your attention to the tip of your nose. I don't know what they think the tip of the nose is. So I'm going to let them tell me what the tip of the nose is for them. So then I can agree or disagree with their description of the tip of the nose after I know what their description is. Oftentimes, if you are too directive, they shut down their own exploration and attempt to discover what you're directing them to discover. And what I want them to do is discover what their experience is, not what I think they should be having. So, tip of the nose. Opening of the mouth. What's the opening of the mouth like? What do you feel? What's the experience of that? And then they'll tell me, and then I can direct them to a better choice, or just accept the choice that they have if it's good enough. What is it like to feel the breath in the back of the throat? And then they'll tell me. What is it like to feel the rising of the chest? And then they'll tell me. And then what is the...
And so you give them the time here where you say, what does it feel like as the chest rises? And then they respond.
Right.
Okay, so you ask the question that's basically guiding their attention into a more relaxed state. And they're responding to every single one of your guidances with how they feel about the experience.
Right. Describing their experience, which is a meditative experience, right? What you're trying to get them to have right off the bat is a meditation experience, not an idea of what a meditation experience should be. And then I say, which of those is the easiest for you to track? And then they tell me. So I don't have to assign anything. They're doing the exploration. They're assigning their attention. And then I say, just watch that. And if you get caught up in thinking, as soon as you recognize it, don't beat yourself up. Just come immediately back. As many times as you need to. There's no limit. And in fact, I would bet as a new meditator, 90+% of the time, you're going to be caught up. But the coming back is actually the practice of meditation, so you're doing it right.
Yes, yes.
I'm big on you're doing it right. And then what you notice is once you begin to develop concentration that the mind quiets, so I don't even need to tell them about that. They discover it on their own. And then, this is something that's very human. It's more valuable because they've discovered it than because I told them that that's what they should be looking for.
Okay, interesting. So we have we'll go ahead and see if this shot gives you guys an okay visualization of it. So what we do is we start off with directly into meditative experience being guided with the how. And so then there are these, the pointing is done experientially with each sentence having a response from the student that is being guided about how it feels. So there's a deep level of engagement and presence with the experience. So there's no blah, 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 and the student's mind is wandering and not paying any attention.
But also, how do you know whether the student has understood your instructions?
Yes.
If you don't ask them and they don't tell you how they've understood
immediately afterward. Every sentence is being confirmed that the student is understanding or not.
Right.
Every sentence. That's really great. Okay, so now we're getting taken through the core part of the how, and then sentence by sentence confirming around our feeling of the experience. And then we're bringing that attention, that very focused, as the mind wanders, we bring it back, and naturally the mind quiets in that process. So interesting. So rather than, in a sense, being told the what of mind quiet and putting that in the North Star position and then undergoing the process of here's the experience of, all right, so let's use the breath as our tool to get to this place of stillness that we've put into the position. And there's a really kind of nice little hand guiding step by sentence, step by step around the direct experience of what is being felt with the breath as the tool that creates the quieting of the mind in a very guided way.
Right.
Cool. Which is basically what is taught in the mystic traditions, but there is a lot of noise in terms of when a not direct, one-on-one, personalized, guided, Jedi-like guidance is happening. Because if it's not that, what it is it's very general is what happens. It's really general, and I've noticed that through some of the times that I've went through like a neti, not this, not that meditation, guiding it for our audience, that it's resonant and helps people, but it's very general because it's not being personalized. Hey, how you doing on this step? Okay, so you're here on this step. How about you? Okay, you're here on that step. Now confirm. Okay, so you're not your mind, you're not your body, you're not your name. And so that is not available because it's just the direct 1 hour to generally to the. So I see there's a big difference. So then when you take like 10 or 20 people, do you go one-on-one? How do you do that?
Well, one of the things that I notice in the West is that most of the meditation instruction is coming from authors, and really they're going around on book tours selling their books and doing sort of helicopter teachings is what I think of it as. Which is lovely, and it creates this discussion about it. But if you want to engage beyond the very beginning of practice, you need to be in a relationship with a teacher who can give you the level of guidance that you need and really understand what your experience is. And so at Mettagroup, one of the things we offer is this one-on-one meditation mentoring. And so people check in twice a month with me, and I remember what they're doing, and I remember the instructions that they've been given, and they report on me in a very Burmese style, this happened, then that 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 happened. What do you think? And so then we get into a dialogue, and then we adjust the practice, and then people have a period of time to practice, and then they come back. And people do tend to make faster progress if that's something that they want. And also they feel more supported. Sometimes when you come out of the belief in conceptual reality and you begin to see things the way that they really are, it's very disorienting. One of the things that I suggest to people is that the more inauthentic you are in the way that you operate your life, the harder all of this is going to be for you. Because not only will you get to a place where you won't be able to do the inauthenticity anymore, but the people that you've been inauthentic with will be furious at you for being inauthentic with them. And so you have to be able to moderate that in a way that people can adapt as you become more capable of coming into an authentic expression. So there's often in the Theravada world this conversation around dark night, but or dark night is a Christian term, knowledge of the miseries is the Buddhist term. That you see that there is no self, and if you've hung your sense of security on there being one, it's frightening. Nothing lasts. You can't count on anything. And if you can't adapt to that being the way that it is, then it's miserable. You're sad. The things that you cling to, the goals that you thought would make you happy don't work. And you can see that. It isn't that it hasn't always been like that and that you haven't been in this confusion about what is actually happening. But that part still takes a sort of an integration. And then, you live in a human body that's going to grow old, get sick, and die, and there's nothing you can do about it. Except find humor. in the aging process because it's a camp. So then you come out to the other side of that, of course, and you see clearly how it is, and that puts you at this crossroads. In one direction is nihilism, right? Nothing matters. It's not going to last. I can't really have anything. It's not worth doing anything. And the other direction, which is actually the one I'm recommending, I do sometimes recommend things, that you go for full engagement, all in every moment, as much as you can. Because if you withhold yourself to avoid the disappointment of losing it, which you're going to do anyway, you don't have the engagement. You just have the losing it, which you're pretty much guaranteed to have. So that's this open, eyes open, fully engaging in each moment in this authentic expression. And what comes from that is this meaningfulness, this richness at being alive. It's amazing to live that way. And when you contrast it to the self-limiting approach that is very common, the protective approach, the need for a sense of artificial safety, what you get out of that, of course, is despair. And when you can see them side by side, why would you ever pick despair over this vibrant aliveness?
Francis Lucille calls it the eternal fireworks. So are you going to enjoy the eternal fireworks? May as well.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Whoops. Sorry. The coughing is just in the spring. So.
I have a couple questions. One of them is, what about self-inquiry or the direct path, becoming aware of awareness, investigating what is I or who is me? What about the questioning the self, questioning the I or the me itself?
I think it's a useful practice. There's a few ways to talk about it. When I was first sitting with Shinzen, he said the self, no self experience is like a walled garden. In the inside of the wall, it's an immaculate, completely trimmed, super maintained, a beautiful garden. And on the outside of the wall, it's just a complete jungle. And there's a gate that goes through the wall. And you can move from the manicured garden to the jungle. And that liberation would actually be able to come and go between the two whenever you wanted. So that if you needed to manifest a brilliant sense of self, you could do it like that. And then if you didn't need it anymore, you could just let it go. And what ends up happening, of course, is in the beginning, you're trapped on one side of the gate or the other, and you can't operate the lock. And then you get better at operating the lock, and you can come and go, but sometimes it gets stuck. Sometimes you get stuck in self, and you immediately see how the suffering is so intense, mind-blowingly intense. And then you go into the no-self side, and you see that you have no motivation to do anything. That you could sit on a bench for a week and not move, and it would be fine. As householders, which we are, neither one of those approaches is going to be very good. And so you want to really get good at moving between the two. Sasaki Roshi used to say, my job as a meditation teacher is a travel agent taking you effortlessly from heaven to hell. Mm-hmm. So that back and forth. If you looked at it from a more Tibetan perspective, it would be an emptiness frame where each time you get caught up in a sense of self and you notice the suffering that arises there, find the sense of self that is suffering. And what you discover, of course, is you can't locate it. And then what you see is this awareness knows a pattern of sensory experience which is identifiable as self, much in the way that anger or happiness would be identified as a pattern of sensing experience, and it takes on no more importance than that sense of any conceptual version of sensing experience. And then you're in freedom. One of the things that's interesting in contrasting that is in holding that open awareness. Open awareness is a tricky term because in the Theravada world it means something different than in the Tibetan world. But if you come into a profound no-self state using the Theravada path, then you don't fixate anything. So if you were talking to me and I was in a profound no-self state, I wouldn't fixate the sound of your voice, and it would just be vibration. And I wouldn't understand what you were saying to me. And I would be able to respond to you from wisdom mind, from that everything. But I wouldn't be able to understand what I was saying. And I wouldn't be able to make a memory of our experience together. And from a neuroscience perspective, depending on the technique you do, it has a different effect on the brain. And so if you shut down the capacity to form autobiographical memory, then you don't remember anything. This is not that practical in householder life. If you go from the Tibetan view, where you just hold this huge, expansive consciousness, this conscious awareness, then you see all of these activities rising in this giant experience, and then you do remember what happens, which I actually have a preference for because it's easier to manage. It's, for instance, years of being interviewed by Shinzen when he's in this no-self state. He doesn't remember anything about the interview, and so it's always a one-off experience, which I've never found helpful, really. Whereas with
you can be in a state of both no self and having memory to be a good travel agent.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So that's the difference. So then when you work with somebody who is in wisdom mind, not identified at all with a sense of self, but at the same time able to allow the formation of conceptual reality to the point that you can understand the language that you're using and how people are responding. I find it has a greater utility, let's put it that way.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I call these crevices. It's almost as though all of these different faces to the one end, all of these many paths to this one end, and truth being this pathless land, and the always already free perfection that we are, just this already is awakening. The very nature of having this as you go up in this awakening process, to have these crevices that are like big amounts of snow that you don't actually know fall into this 50-foot crevice that nobody's going to find you and you'll die. In a sense, the crevices are like this. You get to be whatever expression of infinity you want to be, and that is coming through to be. But that if you fall into this crevice where you abide in this perpetual no self, no symbolism, no memory, have whatever understanding of the unique expression that you are, but remember that your bodhisattva is not going to be as potent. So your travel agent ability is not going to be as potent. And to be a travel agent or to be a bodhisattva, to be this sort of Jedi that's able to navigate across all these different lenses of non-duality, duality, individuation, awakening, popping into awareness, popping into source, void, emptiness, being infinity. Do you know how to navigate all of that? Or are you stuck parroting a specific... So I found that the more of a travel agent you are, the more you're actually able to be a shepherd or a steward of the creation's awakening.
Yep. One of the things that I notice is that in the beginning, practice is very oriented around personal suffering and the pursuit of the relief of personal suffering, but that isn't that hard. Then you see in the distance happiness jumping on the horizon, and you think, oh, I'll go for happiness, and then you go after happiness, and then that's not that hard. And then you see freedom, and you go for that. That's a little harder, but it is actually totally worth doing.
And then it was hilarious because it was here the whole time.
Well, that's a bummer. As Dad says, which this is the metaphor I quite like. It's cloudy. Does that mean the sun isn't shining? So,
very simple.
Sweeping away the obscurations that prevent you from seeing. So then it also depends a lot on what the conditioning is. Did you ever play a game called Minesweeper?
Yeah.
I liken it to that. Sometimes you click on a square and half the board opens up and it's totally effortless. And sometimes you click on a square and every single square around you has a high number. And you click on it and the game blows up. So the conditioning for everybody is different, and it really is dependent on what happened. And so the one size fits all doesn't really help because everybody's conditioning is different. And so then you need to be able to meet the person and their conditioning and then find patience. I'm not a particularly patient person, but I do find that I can find compassion for people if they're actually ardent in their effort.
Yeah. There's a lot of value in the very meticulous how-ness of training attention and using the breath as the tool. Huge benefit. Insane utility, and we'll talk about this like we did in the first hour before we started the podcast, where there's a tremendous utility in it in entrepreneurship and in science and engineering and creativity and even your relationship with your spouse or your kids, your friends. Just the pause in itself and training the non-reactivity, but the observer or the witnessing creates this joy and peace rather than the needing to force the perspective into everything. So that in itself has extreme utility, even in the practical matrixy infrastructures. Yet that is sometimes overly done, in the sense of nobody ever sometimes tells meditators to get off of the cushion and not only to investigate the nature of who is it that is even meditating, first of all, right? So you're a person that's meditating, and then you never question what it means to be a person. You never question life itself. You never question what your source is, and if your identity is actually the very source and force of creation, and that can propel this no self. So there's that, and then there's also the component of get off of the cushion and weave your realizations into society. Can meditation be when you're at a grocery store and you're checking out and you're smiling and you're holding the space of emptiness and joy and peace while you're in your engagement with the person that's checking you out, the checker?
I think one of the reasons that I gravitated to Shinzen and also to Dan is that the main practice is the practice in life. The cushion is just training yourself to be able to do it well enough so that you can take it out, but the emphasis was always on taking it out. It was never in withdrawing onto the cushion. And so all of the just instructions you'll get from me or from them would be that this is just, the formal practice is just training you so that you can take it out in life, and the majority of the practice is as a practice in life. So that actually has never been much of a concern of mine, because that's never the teachers that I was drawn to never taught that. So, so to piggyback a little bit on the conversation about concentration, when I started teaching at a meditation center in Los Angeles, I was trying to teach basic Shinzen techniques. One of the things about Western practice is that most of the instruction that you get in meditation in the early period, so this is for, say, the 70s on, was based on retreat practice. So you went to a retreat and you learned to practice. And so we call it dry vipassana. I'm a metta vipassana teacher mainly, so that's what we talk about. You don't do any preliminary concentration practice because you sit on these long retreats, and in meditating for hours and hours every day, the concentration develops just as a de facto quality of that kind of practice, and then you can go into the insight practice. When I was teaching in the meditation center, 90+% of people never went on retreats, and so the basics, the super basic Shinzen techniques were too difficult to do. And so what was really happening is that people were sitting on the cushion and having daydreaming experiences, not meditation experiences, because they didn't have the preliminary capacity to do the simplest meditation techniques. And so when I began to teach, I began to impose concentration practice as a prerequisite for insight practice. And it was a simple fix. People sit and do preliminary concentration practices for a couple of months, then they have access concentration, and they can zoom along on their insight practices that if they don't do the preliminary practices, they never really get to see the potential of.
Yes, agreed. And this is also where the scenarios have happened where you'll take somebody that gains a little bit of insight into the nature of everything already being free and perfect, and yet they'll still have ego flare-ups.
Right.
Yeah.
So then the other thing that would happen is that people would get into areas of unresolved psychological difficulty from doing the insight techniques, and they wouldn't know how to manage them, and the intensity of the experiences would often be so negative that they would withdraw from meditation altogether for a period of time, and then the suffering would grow. We talked about this earlier. And then when the suffering again propelled them to start practicing, and they would practice again, but they would be in this cycle of some practice, some intense practice, then no practice. So what I discovered was that what was most beneficial was to develop this capacity of the heart, so that you develop the capacity to be kind to yourself. You develop the capacity to be compassionate for the experiences you had. You develop your capacity for joyfulness and for balance, so that if something happens in the insight side of practice, you can rush back into the heart practices and have this container to settle and come back into a place of kindness for yourself. It's very common, excuse me, in Western practitioners to have a very harsh relationship to the self. And when you get into the Vipassana side, it can activate that. And then they're having this experience of, severe self-criticism in the meditation and completely derailing it. And so in this Metta Vipassana integrated practice, you come in, and the first practice is you do develop this capacity for kindness. So the way that Dan Brown frames it is, these are two separate systems. There is the system for negative experience and the system for positive experience. You can do all of this work to limit the intensity of the negative experiences, but if you don't do work to intentionally improve the capacity for positive experience, that never develops. And so it is this balance between really pumping up the positive experiences and your capacity to tolerate very positive experiences and mitigating the negative experiences that actually make the more advanced practices easier to do, because often the intensity of the bliss experiences that come from more advanced practice are overwhelming for people, and they don't experience overwhelming emotion as positive. They experience it as difficult or troublesome. And so these early practices need to be there so that when you are hit with a bliss bomb, say, you can just be delighted that you're in this bliss bomb and not completely derailed and suddenly spin into anxiety instead of just being able to bliss out for a while.
Interesting, almost as though when the bliss bomb hits and you're rolling on the floor laughing and you're just collapsed on the sidewalk laughing at the ineffable perfection and freedom, that are you anxious about how other people are looking at you? And that would be the disaster, rather than being able to see that that is the same one intelligence looking at another component of the one intelligence. And that way then there's no anxiety.
Right.
And so then
there's freedom.
There's freedom. Even if that person is in the matrix and they're looking with, why are you happy? They're the bliss police and they're angry, that you see the entirety of the whole. And rather than having that, that's critical.
We have emotions, we have emotional regulation systems. Most of the time, we regulate our emotions through thinking, so repetitive thoughts. We have a negative experience and it exceeds the window of tolerance. That's a Dan Siegel frame. Then the mind will use the regulation strategies it has to regulate that. If you have an intensely negative experience and you use this harsh self-talk to regulate it, the mind will turn on the self-talk. And it takes you out of the present moment into thinking, and that's the process of regulation. If you have a very intense positive emotion and it exceeds your window of tolerance, the mind is going to look to the database for how to regulate it. And if you use very harsh self-criticism to regulate positive experience that exceeds your capacity to hold it, you're going to go from very positive to very critical, because the body-mind will have to regulate. And so you really want to, part of this investigation is to see what you're doing so that you can make the adjustments to the system so that you'll get to a place where you can actually support the deep advanced practice. Because if you don't do it, the system that's in place is just not going to allow it.
So the vast majority of this can also be boiled down to patterns and becoming aware of the patterns, and also becoming more sovereign in the scripts that are running, taking a neurobiological angle on this and doing it from a place of wanting to know one's true nature above all else, and being so earnest in that process that you can get really good at the attention practices and get really good at understanding all of these components, but also recognize that you can sort of liberate yourself to this state of recognizing that I am the very empty source that has this very illusory sense of I that experiences infinite creation. And if you sort of see yourself as that very one intelligence that is eternal, that is infinite in its creativity, and that all of this is that one intelligence, and there is no separation, and you're perpetually come from a place of how do I serve my own creation rather than how do I extract from it. And so there's like, if you can pop to this quote, like last stage of awakening, and just begin seeing it all as that one intelligence at play with itself, and then come from a place of serving it in a sense, and stay perpetually empty, repeatedly abide in the very emptiness, experiencing the infinite creation, and also abide in the place of serving, coming from a place of serving the one intelligence, then a lot of this so-called all of these ways to talk about the mind can, in a sense, be, you can transcend that, and then as it comes up, you'll be ready for it because you'll see it come up, like you described, where you see, because you've trained this vigilance, you see the more conditioned personhood habit arise, and you can tell, in a sense, when there is a trajectory off of this very empty sourcefulness in service to its creation, where the trajectory comes up and it's this old pattern, this old script where it was trying to manipulate or extract some sort of validation. And so that's this kind of coming from the place of wanting to radically accept, know, love, and accept yourself and the creation exactly how it is, and then pop to the very sourceful, awakened state of this all being one intelligence at play with itself, and then sort of dealing with the conditionings as they arise. It's like a direct path popping bird's way rather than this very slow ant's way, but that has very important components to it, like we've been talking about with training the attention. In a sense, we've also talked about this quite a bit, but the idea of neo-advaita, or the so-called, direct pointing to this very nature of no self, all being a dream, is very important. And yet at the same time, the mind being trained to sort of become quiet really enables this insight. And in doing so, it stabilizes the realization. And that stability of awakening enables the travel agent. The very stableness to it.
Well, that's the puzzle. The taste of awakening is ordinary. Everybody's probably had it. They may not recognize that that's what it is. But like you say, it's always here, and it's very common. It's ordinary. What's not ordinary is to be able to stabilize the view of it. And so that's where everything gets in the way. And then how do you tackle that process? And as a practice in life. For instance, Dan tells a story that he was had the taste of awakening, and his teacher said that he needed to stabilize it. And so what he was going to do was have him sit in the doorway of the office and control the flow of people who went in and out while he was attempting to stabilize his awakening, and that he would have to stay there until it was stable.
Which is why in so many of the Enlightenment jokes, it's, okay, now go back home
Right.
and sit with your family for a week.
I also recommend that even if it's not enlightenment, because if you can't recognize your own conditioning, you'll see it in them.
Yes.
And they have the same conditioning you do. If you want to know how you regulate your emotions, go home and look at how everybody else is doing it, because you're doing it the same way. And then evaluate whether you think it's a good way or a bad way. And if it's a bad way, stop doing it. And if it's a good way, reinforce it. What, of course, happens then is that you have deficits of capacity to regulate, and then you have to train yourself to regulate in a different way. So you want to train yourself out of afflictive emotional regulation strategies into beneficial strategies, but you have to see them in order to know what to do. And so that's that piece. How do you see it? And then from the point of view of a teacher, it isn't useful to somebody for you to describe to them how you see it and tell them to look for that. What might be useful is describing the process of how you saw it, and then suggesting that they investigate how to see it, which they will know because their conditioning is different than yours, and your conditioned responses are different than theirs. And you can't point that out for them. They have to discover it themselves. So in teaching somebody this stuff, you have to again and again push them to examine what their experience is, particularly, not generally, and not yours. One of the things I notice a lot in teachers is that they're very good at describing their experience, but they haven't figured out that it isn't universal.
The very nature of the travel agent is what's most exciting, or the bodhisattva, that which is really able to take whatever confused seeking impulse that is approached to the entity and be able to provide a really strong reflection that creates a self-inquiry on the entity's end. So that very ability to learn how to reflect and how to stay quiet and still and empty until the spontaneous, best, effortless words come is something that I found to be important to train, to abide in. I'd be curious, do you feel emptiness witnessing infinite creation?
I would need to know what you mean.
Well, how does that resonate with you?
Well, the main practice I'm doing now is called self-arising, self-liberating. And it's holding that expansive experience, not so tightly that it just becomes wordless, soundless, and not so loosely that you get caught up in things, so that this process of being, Dan describes it as, it's as if you're writing the message on water. You're able to detect the message, but you don't cling to it at all, so it disappears immediately. So that's that place of balance.
Self-arising and
Liberating.
So, in essence, that the very infinite creation is having a self-appearance and a self-liberation, and a self-appearance and a self-liberation without any clinging at all to any quote past or any quote
Right.
future. And just enjoy the very freedom and perfection.
Yes. Stabilize that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I say things like to Dan, you have these elaborate explanations of all of these things and this elaborate languaging of all of these things. They don't really resonate with me. And he says, they don't need to.
Yeah.
He also says that in the West, science is what's miraculous. And the miraculous is no longer miraculous in that sense. So one of the things I like to do when I go sit with the Sayadaw in Myanmar is listen to his tales of people flying and all sorts of
That's funny that people think that the
magical-
analysis of form is miraculous.
it's kind of limiting. So
When did we come to that understanding? Yeah. Well, it's a miracle. The very fundamental unit of biology of the cell is, in fact, a beautiful miracle. But at the same time, realizing emptiness is a miracle.
well, the faith in all of those constructs, which are really temporary, is what's hilarious.
Yeah.
So the Sayadaw was describing this story of some students of his, and the mother was old and moving too slowly, and they were impatient to go to the festival, and so they informed her that she would have to stay at home because she wasn't ready. And then they took a cab to the festival, and she went into a moment of compassion and practiced her metta, and then the bliss that arose transported her, and she flew across the city, and she arrived at the festival before they did. And immediately one of the German kids in the front row said, "Could you demonstrate that for us now?"
Yeah.
Right over the Sayadaw's head. And then I said to the Sayadaw, quite a metaphor. And he said, "You have that sharp Western mind, which means you can't see what's right in front of you."
Yes. That's such a good way to put it.
Which had me laughing for days.
Wow. What a good way to put it.
Yeah.
The sharp Western mind can't even see what's right in front of it, aka the very screen on which all the modulations happen.
Right. So
That's such a good way to put it. Such a good way to put it. That's why my nervous system went into shock and I just started crying in the fetal position for like 10 straight minutes when the first pop into awareness happened. Because it was right there the whole fucking time.
I call it bittersweet.
Bittersweet.
Bitter because that's how it is. Sweet because you can do it now.
You can do it now. Yep. Yeah, that's you really get the greatest of all time, Rumi. You go from room to room looking for the diamond that's already around your neck, and then what is hilarious is that then you go and you try and like explain when people ask, like heal this confused seeking impulse. What do I do? And then like you ask, are you aware that you exist? It's like, yes. Are you aware that you're aware? Yes. But it's so funny how fast it just it's like a confirming of it. Even for me, 5 years ago, nobody asked me that exact question, but that feeling of how quickly you just dismiss the fact of beingness or isness or awareness or I amness, how fast it's just dismissed, how fast God is just dismissed for the modulations of the screen itself. I am this, I am that, I am career, I am identity, I am name, I am form. That's that's the whole argument.
Right.
And so the turn inward from all of that is the cessation of the argument with God and the abiding in God itself, which then enables the purification, and it enables coming from a place of service rather than from a place of extraction. Yeah, and yeah, it's right here, just the screen that you're watching this on before it's modulated. And it's the same thing with the very, just take the very nature of the blank canvas and just how many different ways can you color this blank canvas with art? It's the same answer as how many different ways can you modulate the screen with images to make movies. Just the level of subtlety with you becoming aware of that being the true nature is atrophied. It's atrophied. The nature of the energetic contraction is that it has atrophied its true nature as the very source of the infinite creation, and it's in its contracted personhood, and it's not focused on this, the very blank screen or blank canvas, and rather it's focused on all of the identity. It's focused on the personhood. It's focused on trying to extract peace and happiness from the creation rather than recognize that the nature of the awareness itself is peace and happiness.
I'd like to use a quantum metaphor for that.
Please, yes.
So in quantum mechanics, of course, in the moment, all of the possibilities are there. All of them, limitless possibilities. As soon as you choose one, the one that you pick becomes solid and all of the other choices are lost. And then in the next moment, everything that's possible from the place you've just chosen opens. And as soon as you pick one, every possibility except for the one you picked falls away. And then that leads you to the next moment where all of the moments that are connected to the moment you're in, that were connected to the preceding moment, open if you can see them. And if you can't see them, what you see is this very sort of puny array of choices that you keep picking. Samsara, this groove, this rut, where you don't allow yourself to see all of the possibilities that are there, just the ones that you're habitually used to choosing. And so it creates the perception that that's all that there is, even though all the time, all of the other choices were there. Which I think is a useful metaphor, because in that moment where you're heading down a sort of vicious cycle, what's opening in the moment is all of the possibilities, including the virtuous cycle, and you could, without obligation to the direction you're going, and choose something else, if you can see it.
Yeah.
So that's the training. The training is to open. And then a lot of those choices are going to have these conditioned reactions of fearfulness or disinterest We're always choosing things that have high value to us as we select what we choose to make conceptual reality out of. You know, your list of high value targets, if you don't evaluate it, might not have great things on it. It might be conditioned from your earliest experiences, but they still might not be that useful to you, and yet they're still on your list of high value targets. And so it's seeing that and then training the mind out of it that often creates the possibility of a view that can then see the other choices that it's obscured from seeing because of that.
Yep. The infinite possibility is here, and the contracted person identity sees one or two of the trajectories.
Right.
And the liberated sees all of them. And working your way with unfreezing the will, the choice, the sovereignty from the algorithms and scripts of those patterns towards the liberated free is just the relaxation of that contracted identity. Relax it, expand it, close the delta, the gap between the way that you see yourself as a person and the way that God sees you right now. Does God have acceptance for the creation exactly as it is? You were saying, yes?
I was just going to say, exactly how?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, how to close. Exactly. The what is closing the gap, and then the how is everything that we've talked about so far. Yeah.
Exactly how do I do that?
Perfect. And that's what the simplified spirituality is the how to close the gap from the person contracted energy to the way that God loves its creation and accepts its creation right now exactly as it is. And again, as we brought up earlier, the very activity of using the breath and becoming aware of the breath, the tool that's always with you, and becoming aware of that repeatedly and becoming aware of the very sky itself, that is where it all arises and passes. And then just walking each person sort of through step by step, sentence by sentence, that process and checking, how does it feel right now? And that's the really tailored, personalized approach. And that's very important versus, I like the word you used earlier, helicopter teachings. Is sort of a good way to put it.
Because I really need it. I would have an experience and I wouldn't be able to integrate it. And then I would ask my teacher and they would tell me what to do. And then I would do that and see how it went. And then in this constant dialogue, move ahead. And so that's really what I think the usefulness of having a regular dialogue with the teacher is. And then you don't actually need a teacher who's a full master if you're not in advanced practice. You just need somebody who's a little bit ahead of you. Mm-hmm. So that we can use people in our community that are also practitioners. So it's also important to have a community of meditators that you're connected to and in dialogue with, because I don't know about you, but have you ever tried to explain esoteric meditation experience with somebody who believes in the solid world? Doesn't go that good.
The question is why? Did they ask to have it explained to them? That's always the funny thing, is ask yourself, was I asked for this? Because if the answer is no, then why are you sharing your gold with somebody that's going to slap it out of your hand?
Well, I'll give you an example. I had a few people over, 3 hardcore meditators, been practicing for a long time, and one person who doesn't practice before, and she was kind of saucer-eyed the whole time. Went well, but it's like, whoa. So, if you get into difficulty, you need support. Who's going to support you? If all of the people around you don't know anything about meditation and don't have any experience of working through meditation experiences, how are they going to support you? So then you're unsupported, and that tends to slow practice down. So you need to have this community around you that will support you. The Sangha, they call it, that supports you, but also you need somebody who is ahead of you enough to be able to understand what's happening. A lot of times, particularly with the dissolution experiences, people get really frightened by them, and they have you hit a tipping point. You're not actually able to go back to the way it was before, with support, it's kind of a bump in the road. Without support, it can be catastrophic. So I really think that that's an important piece of this. If you want to go deep,
Yes,
you need to put this support group around you
absolutely.
first. Because otherwise you'll just have to keep slowing down.
Yep.
I did mention I'm not that patient.
This is a critical part of the awakening architectures, is having this both one-on-one, where there's a personalized distillation for exactly where the person's at, as well as the integrative post trampolining. You get these landing zones that sort of help. I would be curious to wrap with you on one last subject, which is,
Yikes.
yeah, we've been already
I need
cruising.
to make a text because I'm late for my next appointment.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, they're already texting me.
Yeah, we did cruise through our time slot. Oh, I see. Also, I was in a session before this, and Tyson had messaged me. I pass you along my love, Tyson. Super grateful for all of your love and epic coordination. Thank you. Thank you. The admin of the Mettagroup. Yeah. Okay, so the question would be, when you experience no self, are you experiencing everything as one? It all as life?
Depends on what practice you're doing. If you're doing a Theravada-oriented practice, you could call it a profound flow state where nothing's fixated, so there's no boundaries in any way. It's just vibratory energy. Any of the sense gates that you turn to, it's just unfixated vibratory energy. So you don't make sound in anything. You don't make visual experience in anything. You can't detect the inside or the outside of the body. You can't detect one sense gate's edge and another sense gate's. It's all just that one flowing vibratory energy space.
Mm-hmm. And there are other sort of no self
Well, I would say
descriptions.
If you're holding a big space and everything is just an arising and a passing of energy events, and the self arises and passes, there's no identification at all with the experience of self, so you could describe that as a no self experience. I tend to think of the no self discussions, though, more toward the Theravada place, and it's described more in Tibetan practices as emptiness practice.
Yeah, that's approximately what is resonating for me right now, and is, I would say, the fundamental last step of the awakening is to abide as the very inexhaustible source of infinite creation, and just going beyond coming and going.
Shinzen used to say he wanted to know what enlightened people did when they weren't doing anything, and so he would sneak up on Sasaki Roshi's house and peep in the window, and he would just be sitting there.
Yeah. Yep.
So
And that's what you could also call holding space. Just abiding in space.
mm-hmm.
And the 2020s will become even noisier, and there will become even more demand for silence, for awakening, for people that know how to just hold space.
Well, yeah, what's coming is going to be intense, and we're going to have to respond in a way that's inclusive, or we're going to be at war. That's how I sort of see it.
Because it's one intelligence. There's, as you mentioned earlier, where do you draw an edge? You can't even draw an edge with your own inhalation of oxygen right now, let alone between you and the very planet that secretes you and keeps you alive. Just become more and more relaxed into the fact that it's one intelligence at play with itself, and then create from that place. And as you do that, then the architectures will be pro-life and anti-war.
Good.
Yeah. Great. Okay, let's wrap.
Thank
All right.
you.
That was super. Thank you, George. That was super.
All right, good.
Loved it. Thanks, Michael. We really appreciate you too. Thank you for making the introduction happen and for making the show happen. That was a blast. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Infinite adoration. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below on the episode. Let us know what you think. Like the video if it brought you value, helps the algorithm. Subscribe if you haven't to the channel. Share the video with people that you feel like this would profoundly influence. Check out our good old friends at the Mettagroup. The link is in the bio below, mettagroup.org. Check it out. And a lot of great classes and retreats are available up there, so go ahead and give that a check out.
Yeah.
And that is all. Thank you. Much love.
Bye.
Bye.